Hello everyone, nice to meet you all virtually. My name is Michaela Laurencin and I'm a Microsoft engineer working on Electron. Today I will be talking about my first experience implementing a large-scale feature in Electron and some lessons I learned during that process. First, a bit about me. I had a bit of exposure from programming back in grade school, starting with Scratch and Alice, before eventually learning languages from senior year of high school through university. Once I graduated from university in spring of 2020, I had no experience working on an open source project until joining the Electron team at Microsoft that fall. Now, after being with the team for nearly 2 years, I have definitely learned a lot. When considering what to talk about for this keynote, I determined that the best thing I could speak on was my entry into the world of open source. There are many ways that you can get started contributing to open source, but I wanted to show you all what my experience was jumping into the deep end with Electron. Though I had no experience working in open source before, I did have experience working on large projects in school. Throughout this presentation, I want to show you the lessons I learned during my process of implementing the Window Controls Overlay in Electron, a new standard that I helped put in place after working within the project for under a year. As those with experience already know, there are some similarities between the types of projects you do in school and in open source, but there are pitfalls you can run into if you get stuck in your classroom mindset. But more than just providing helpful advice for those new to open source and programming, for those more experienced and farther along in their careers, I want to point these out as things that someone starting out might not know. Some of these things may seem obvious, and maybe they are second nature to you now, but hopefully this gives you a bit more context and perspective. Okay, so what even is the Window Controls Overlay? It is a web standard that allows for others to easily make a custom title bar with the typical title bar stylings that exist for modern desktop applications. This allows for web applications to have a custom title bar that functions like a native one. In its general form, this overlay ensures users can minimize, maximize, restore, and close the application, and also provides access to relevant browser controls via the web app menu. For Chromium browsers displayed in left to right languages, the content flows as follows, starting from the left inner edge of the overlay. A draggable region that is the same width and height of each of the window controls buttons. The Settings and More 3-dot button, which gives users access to extensions, security information about the page, access to cookies, etc. The window controls buttons, Minimize, Maximize, Restore, and Close. On operating systems that only support full screen windows, the Minimize Restore buttons will be omitted. From Chromium browsers displayed in right to left languages, the order within the Window Controls Overlay will be flipped, and the overlay will appear in the upper left corner of the client area. Various APIs and CSS variables then exist for setting and getting dimensions of the title bar region. For the final implementation in Electron, on both macOS and Windows, only the Minimize, Maximize, Restore, and Close buttons would be present. Additionally, the macOS functionality would act as it typically does and have the order within the Window Controls Overlay flipped compared to Windows OS for each language ordering. Before moving forward, there are several terms that involve the word window throughout this feature. So in order for things to be more clear, I will refer to the Windows operating system as Win, the application window as the window, and the Window Controls Overlay as its initialism, WCO. With that out of the way, let's move on to the process of actually implementing WCO for Electron. First lesson, documentation, documentation, documentation. So we have a goal, but where do we even get started? With such a large body of source code, it can sometimes feel like the best thing to do is just start wading through, pick a place to start contributing, and hope for the best. This is where documentation is your friend, and a friend you will want to provide others when you're done, but we'll revisit that later. Documentation can range in specificity, but for this feature, I had a specific document that laid out all the aspects of the new standard, but it did not cover everything that needed to be considered for Electron. It can be easy to fall into the trap of just reading documentation and taking it as the absolute truth, but you will want to consider some things. First, a lot of times, especially for newer ideas or projects, documentation is a living document. In this case, that means some of the information may be missing, not fully fleshed out, forgotten about, etc. Some information may even seem contradictory as multiple people contribute to it. Next, some of the information may be irrelevant to you. Coming from a classroom environment where a project was a well-designed test of your skill, it can be hard to read something and disregard it as not necessary for your final product. For this feature, the explainer document was referring to usage within progressive web apps. Thus, aspects such as displaying page origin information would not be relevant to Electron, and other aspects, such as declarations made within the web app manifest, would be needed to be addressed in other ways. Third, you will probably have to fill in the gaps. Again, a feature idea or write-up will not necessarily consider all the things you will need to do. In the case of this specific feature, there were a number of things that were not mentioned in the standard document, as they were Electron-specific considerations. For example, allowing users to customize overlay height, button colors, and to dynamically adjust these settings. Next lesson, asking for help. Just ask for help is thrown around as generic advice when you get into any new situation. But for many, especially those who are just getting started and not as confident, the how is extremely important, and rarely talked about. Additionally, there are many times where you do not have a clear piece of documentation to go off of, like I did for this feature. It may even just be a cool idea you have. One of the first things I realized when working in open source is that there are so many different people and places you can ask questions. For this feature, I relied heavily on directly reaching out to my colleagues. If you are working in a space that you see someone else has worked in, chances are they can offer some advice or help. It is important to be mindful of an individual's time, but there are many people who are out there eager to help you get something across the finish line. If direct messaging isn't an option for you, group chats or forums are another great tool. Electron, for example, has a Discord server where you can meet other developers and come together to solve problems. Lastly, if a project has an issue tracker, this can be a great way to have conversation exclusively around creating a feature and having others with a similar goal come together and exchange ideas. This can also grow into having people come to help you once you've submitted a PR for a feature and are working to solve bugs or refine it. This also was a great help to me during the implementation of this feature. Lesson 3. Written code is your friend. In school, it is seen as nearly blasphemous to use code from another source. Sometimes even just reading someone else's implementation of something similar to what you're working on can cost you your grade. While this is great for building a foundation, what I have found to be even more important in open source is reading others' code and knowing what I need to create from scratch, what I can modify, and what I can reuse. This is probably one of the hardest aspects of thinking to change when transitioning out of school. That being said, reading code and citing code can really save you both time laboring as well as actual code processing time. It may be fun to come up with all the ways you can implement bubble sort, but when it comes to more complex operations and structures, you can lose out on a lot of insight from others if you do not expand your horizons. Now, let me walk you through how WCO was implemented in Electron with those 3 different approaches: using code directly, modifying code for the needs and structure of Electron, and lastly, implementing from scratch. First, as you can see here in your JavaScript and CSS files, you specify several different settings. In the CSS, there are predetermined dimensional variables used by the system to signal that these attributes will be governed by the WCO. In the JavaScript, the parameters titleBarStyle and newly created titleBarOverlay are then set to hidden and true respectively to activate the default WCO features for the window. One can customize the height of the title bar region by instead having titleBarOverlay be an object with a parameter. On Win, one can also customize the coloration of the buttons by adding another parameter to titleBarOverlay. While the CSS was already something baked into the Chromium implementation, these JavaScript parameters needed to be modified and created so that the functionality could take place on the Electron side. From there, we get into the C++. On both macOS and Win, the predetermined values from the CSS are funneled directly back to Chromium so that the window reserves the title bar area appropriately. If a height is set in title bar overlay, that information is passed in and set as well. On Win, the button color information from title bar overlay may also be passed in. These then influence the hit test information for all the various regions and also how the buttons react in different scenarios, like when a button is hovered over. The implementation of the buttons from Chromium was used as a basis for the Electron one, but modifications needed to be made for supporting Electron's window structure. Functionality also needed to be established for the button's aesthetic modifications that Chromium did not have for theirs. On macOS, as the button dimensions and color are pre-established by the OS, they just need to be positioned properly and have the title bar region respond properly to events such as being dragged. The functionality for positioning these buttons already existed within Electron, so that was leveraged. Lastly, Lesson 4, Work in Progress, where I tell you obviously everything went perfectly to plan and there were no errors. Unfortunately, even if you think you followed the standard to a T, even if you read back through your code and you made sure all the subfeatures you wanted to implement have been accounted for, you will probably still run into issues. And that's okay. For me, this consisted of things ranging from not having the proper messages returned while hit testing, which resulted in accessibility tools like tooltips not working, to the colors of the buttons and their symbols not shifting properly between hover and non-hover states. With so many things not going to plan, it was a bit frustrating. These may be points in which you seek out help, but also may be good points to reflect on your goal. Rather than, for example, getting bogged down in one method of window maximization throwing off the button alignment, I went back and considered whether or not this would make or break the feature. Does not overcoming every hurdle mean that the project is a failure and the feature should be thrown out? No. One recent example that has been noted by users is that transparent buttons result in a host of unexpected behavior. Through obstacles such as this, though, I have learned another important open source distinction, that it is less set in stone than a class assignment. If something was overlooked before an assignment was submitted, then you can't do anything about it afterwards. With open source, there's a chance to go back, fix your bugs, and add to features. This may involve a lot of refactoring at times, but it is amazing knowing that as you learn more about a specific area of a code base or subject area, you can make a feature better and better over time. Though transparent buttons is still something that will need to be revisited, I was able to overcome the other issues using the previous lessons. This is also the time in which you now get to make documentation that helps people both understand what your feature is capable of, but also what it is not capable of. This serves to help users in developing what they want to, but also invites others to investigate and solve a known problem if they too are trying to get more into open source. You can now help someone who was in your shoes before, not knowing where they can most helpfully contribute. I still consider myself on the starting end of my open source journey, but by going through this experience, I now find it less intimidating to tackle new bugs and features. Hopefully you too can use some aspect of these lessons to help you or someone you know dive more into open source. Because if anything, the biggest lesson I've learned is that we are all trying to make the best products available the world over. So if one of us succeeds, we all do. Thank you for your time.